This video is going to be a very special one on behalf of the new class reboot that we recently got. This video will cover all the major topics relative to the new Sorc we have, as well as showcase and give you guys a proper idea of what Sorc is and what it can do, the performance levels in different categories, and finally a solid verdict of both Awakening and Succession all together. With that being said, let's get this video started. Let me introduce you into the class known as Sorceress. Awakening Sorceress adds another element to her dark magic antics, which is known as her iconic scythe. This Awakening weapon adds new capabilities to her assassin playstyle. She can now utilize 2 more movement options with the protection of an iframe, the ability to vanish in thin air and to reappear for a stealth attack, several high damage attacks and protected super armor for trading capabilities, and lastly an overall capable assassin scythe user with great and slippery mobility, damage trade potential, comfortable APM in gameplay, and the freedom to play at any skill ceiling. And let's cover the Succession Sorceress. Succession Sorceress is the pure dark magic user, fully enhanced in the Awakening abilities, making her a full-fledged assassin mage, using only her amulet and talisman. Her playstyle and strategy center around AoE damage in the form of frontal guards, while also being heavily based in combo techniques. She has the capability to throw long-range mage-like abilities while also producing several medium-range AoE damage. She's an overall APM steady class that offers combo potential and great PvE performance. When it comes to gear and skill points, there's some important things to consider that may affect your overall judgment on the class itself. Succession Sorc will cost you about 1700 to 1800 skill points to be solid in both PvE and PvP, while Awakening can cost you anywhere from 2000 to even 2200 skill points for both PvE and PvP as well. But if you wanted the absolute bare minimum, you could say 1500 for Succession and 17, possibly 1800 for Awakening. When it comes to gear, both Succession and Awakening Sorcs are not the spiciest at lower gear levels. If you were to create a playthrough with seasonal characters, dozens of other classes would outperform in PvP damage and PvE results, trial characters included. However, in later higher AP brackets, you will eventually start to feel the damage kicking in, but not necessarily ridiculous damage and burst as some classes have. And as long as you reach anywhere from 341 to 359-ish DP, you'll be in a solid spot. Anything below will make you feel arguably squishy in all forms of the game, and anything above does help you to feel more comfortable with frontal guards and super armor. Although due to the major increase in damage by classes in the game after reworks, don't be surprised if you feel squishy as a sorceress regardless of what DP you have, since we are an assassin based class anyways. Next topic to dive into is the 1v1 aspect. Here we'll discuss the Awakening Sorceress summary performance in this category. The skill entry and skill floor has been lowered after the reworks and has made getting into Awakening Sorceress much easier. When it comes to 1v1s, it's still to be a class to learn and master your craft, but allows you to play at a much lower level if you wanted to. This also ties into nicely its skill ceiling. Awakening Sorceress allows you to get creative and skillful with your combo creation on the spot, utilizing your different options of damage and CC to connect and perform a successful combo. The movement itself for 1v1s is overall in a solid spot. The distance is considered short range, with 2 of them at medium range. It will not be at the range and distance of casters, but more so the shorter length for close range combat situations. The speed of these movements are average at best, a solid tempo consistency, but not too slow or too fast. On top of that, there are numerous options to use for mobility choices that give you flexibility in how you want to move. Plenty of choices to use from, but overall use a core set of movement as your main option of choice. The survivability and protections of these movements are in a good spot, giving you a variety of different protections to rotate and use for certain situations. Mixing in your iframes with your other options of choice helps to make you a very hard to catch assassin. The stamina management is going to be steady and reasonable, only matching your level of skill when rotating movements properly. As far as engage and disengage goes, it's not the most impressive aspect, but definitely a workable one. She may not be able to engage in the most optimal way, but definitely has several methods of pulling it off effectively. The disengage is rather tricky since you as a player would have to try your hardest to dance around with movement options and protections while trying to leave the fight. Since the distance and speed factor isn't that high, the disengage is not going to be easy. It would depend on your ability to dance your way out of a fight. A special honorable mentions would be the Nightmare ability. The combo potential for this class is reasonably high, considering the options you'd have, the cancel mechanic needed, and the transitions between Awakening and Reawakening, plenty of combos to make and learn, giving you the freedom to pick your own favorites. And lastly, the utility of this class unfortunately is not much to mention in comparison to other classes. Catching your opponents will depend on your mechanical speed and overall skill in catching opponents the old-fashioned way. Then we have Succession Sorceress. The skill entry and skill floor has remained near the same after reworks, easy to learn and also hard to master. However, the Succession Sorceress skill floor in 1v1s is a bit higher than most. You won't be able to get away with the minimum effort to play and win. You'd have to put more skill and effort to pull off Succession Sorceress in a 1v1. And the skill ceiling itself is unfortunately not too high, as the class spec does not give you too much to work with and ultimately caps your potential overall. Very few Succession Sorcerers were able to break the skill ceiling and even go so far as to winning the Arena of Arsha tournament. The movement of Succession Sorc sadly isn't in the best spot, especially for 1v1s. The distance is considered short range based, with 2 movements barely at medium distance. The mobility options are very few, with only 3 main abilities to use to move around with. Only other options would be through your bombs, and that's it. The speed of Succession Sorc's movement can actually be slightly above average. The abilities used to move around with are nicely cancelled with each other and can create small bursts of movement occasionally. The survivability and protections are okay in terms of 1v1s. They are mostly frontal based with damage and protections, and only have very little super armor options, and the one iframe of choice. Succession Sorc's main choice of protection will be lingering and rotating through all of our frontal guards. Granted, plenty of 1v1 classes do have the capabilities to actually abuse your frontal guard, so in a sense it does kind of negate the protection and survivability of Sorc, considering how easily it is to counter and punish a frontal guard. The stamina side of Succession Sorc is arguably one of the hardest things to deal with in most other classes, because you can mostly only use 3 to 4 movement options. You find yourself using your only iframe in between your movements to get around, thus causing your stamina to bleed very heavily. Stamina management is one of the trickiest things to manage on Sorc's kit, and will put your skills and patience to the test. The engage and disengage is not worth mentioning here, since because of the other topics I just covered, all of those issues factor into here as well. Not too many mobility options to use, coupled with stamina issues, not too much distance length to work with, overall making both engage and disengage a very tricky thing. It's definitely doable, but will require you to think outside the box. The combo potential still offers creative flexibility. However, after the reworks, our main CC combo chains are going to be stiffens and floats. We do still have the options to knock down and bound, however, it will require you to think creatively. Otherwise, we can still put together cool and effective combos, only slightly less options to work with than Awakening has. And lastly, the utility. Sadly, Sorc has hardly any, or rather no, utility to use. Less than Awakening Sorc, and Awakening Sorc already lacked in it as it is. Sorc's main way to catch opponents will be through old-fashioned means. Awakening's performance in 1v1 overall after reworks is decent. She not only got more protections to work with, but also got more floats to catch and combo with. The resistance nerf allows her KD combos to be more reliable, but unfortunately, the Blades of Darkness nerf did make her less aggressive. Her damage did spread across her kit after the reworks too. In essence, she stayed near the same in 1v1 with a deserving 8 out of 10 rating. Succession's performance in 1v1 fundamentally stayed the same, but acquired more frontal guard damage to rotate with. Frontal guards are typically a better option to trade with than super armors, allowing her more options on that front. Combos, movement, and damage stayed the same, and sadly got no new abilities or massive changes to compete with other classes. It'll require a bit more tweaking in addition to her, so on that note, her overall rating would be a 4 to 5 out of 10. And now onward to the PvE aspect. First thing to cover are the subtopics for both specs. First up, we have the camp to camp mobility. Succession mobility from camp to camp is one that I would consider satisfactory, but gets the job done nevertheless. She can use 2 to 4 movement options and reach each camp in reasonable time. Awakening's mobility from camp to camp after the reworks has been buffed. She can now use a longer rushing crow ability into Shadow Leap for a decently sized distance gap. This will allow her easy access from camp to camp and an easy effort with just 2 abilities. She has other options on top of that if needed. Overall, a really solid distance gap closer. The performance of both Awakening and Succession in PvE is very good, all things considered. With Succession Sorc getting arguably massive PvE buffs, its performance is the one that stands anywhere from A+ at the very least, and S- at most. Its damage and clear speed has been increased to noticeable amounts. Overall, a very strong contender for strong PvEers. Awaiting Sorc is not far off from Succession Sorc in terms of PvE, but definitely is below Sorc in terms of performance. It stands at a comfortable A+ all around, just a bit below Succession Sorc. Its damage is great and will always be consistent. The APM required is overall steady and nothing too harsh on the fingers, but definitely gives you room to go beyond the average APM threshold if you wanted to get serious and sweaty. The protections for Sorc's combo is going to be predominantly frontal-based protections with a bit of super armor here and there, given Sorc's PvE combo, nearly full protected. This is of course including the obligatory iframe for both of them. While Awakening is now mostly protective with super armors, both are arguably very safe grinders in terms of overall protection and gives you room to time your protections if needed, with iframe cancels in between your PvE combo. Now for a quick summary performance at the lower end PvE spots. Both Succession and Awakening perform fairly decent at these lower end spots, with Awakening having the mobility advantage to get from camp to camp fairly faster than Succession, while Succession will have the better choices for AoE damages. Both will ultimately have their strengths and weaknesses when it comes to these spots, and will both provide results. Awakening basically stayed the same here, and Succession definitely didn't change at all. Both are roughly the same as they were before reworks for lower end spots. Next up we have the higher end PvE spots. Of course, with these spots in the current BDO PvE meta, these will ultimately be one of the best and most relevant spots to talk and compare about when it comes to overall performance. Sorc with its PvE buffs overall perform exceptionally well. Arguably, its only weakness is the lack of better movement from camp to camp. But as far as its damage, clear speed, frontal protections, and solid AoEs, Sorc definitely showcases how good she really is in these spots especially. It's also worth noting the Sorc and Elvia weapons combined make an insane duo, allowing her to seemingly use one ability to clear each camp. Depending on your AP, it can vary up to 2, maybe 3 at most. Otherwise, Succession Sorc's cherry on top is the feel-good aspect with the weapons in Elvia. Outside of that, it's a great grinder in these spots overall. And with the Awakening Sorc, it's also in a similar boat with Succession Sorc. Although it's slightly below, the mobility camp to camp is still worth mentioning, and the damage and clear speed is still very good. The more AP you have, the better it gets, until eventually you can nuke each camp with less and less abilities. Both Sorcs are very good in PvE and offer you room to improve on your combos, add-ons, cancels, speed, and even pulls. Nice thing about Sorc is the room to grow and improve that can help make things interesting for players looking to push themselves in PvE optimization. With that being said, with everything that I've mentioned, Awakening's PvE performance here is a solid 7 to 8 out of 10 in those spots. And in Succession Sorc's case, PvE performance is a comfortable 8 out of 10. Only thing holding Succession Sorc back is her mobility in some spots. Otherwise, both are very solid. Then lastly, the group grind spots. In hindsight, both Sorcs may not have the best feats in a group-oriented grind spot, considering they don't really offer large forms of mob pulling, speed spells, even evasion debuffs from shies, heals, or other forms of protection or utility for mob aggro or teammates. But as it turns out, they do at the very least offer AP buffs to nearby allies and overall act as a great DPS users, so long as the Sorcs know what they are doing and have a solid gear score. Now after reworks, having the competent geared Sorc will be a great option for damage dealers, especially after the PvE buffs. Thanks to both Succession and Awakening's protection increase, they can definitely hold their own without having to feel too dependent on your group than before. And the cherry on top is their iconic iframe that can allow them easy access to stay even safer the better the player is. A great DPS role with the added bonus of survivability on their own makes them a solid pick as DPS in general. Then the last category will be the 1vx group PvP. In the 10v10 and 20v20 skirmish scenarios is where the very geared and or skilled Sorcs will stand out arguably. In Awakening's case, they have plenty of targets to play with in terms of utilizing their super armor damages and showcasing the enemy just how slippery and flexible their movements can be. Their iframes do a great job of avoiding tons of AoE damage. In Succession's case, it'll be a true test of their positioning with rotating frontals and using their AoE damages at the right time for kill feeds. They may not be as slippery as Awakening, but definitely offer damage pressure constantly with the lower cooldowns and frontal guards to train trade with. Awakening will have a bit more damage to play with in PvP, but Sorc's strength will be their consistent DPS rotation and positioning. In this scenario, they both will often dance in the backline and or the sides for a more comfortable position. They can and do have the ability to get in the heat of the fight, but play a very dangerous, high risk, high reward gameplay. In the Node War setting, while Sorcs play a role that center around purely staying in the sideline for picks, while finding an opportunity to reach the backline for disruption and possibly kill feeds. Sticking with the huge group of teammates is what some Sorcs may do to stay on objective calls, but typically flush out in a better position to utilize their assassin playstyle. Not only can they both get inside a base for 1vx potential, but also serve as a major intentional or unintentional distraction factor. If the Sorc is geared enough or skilled enough, they definitely have the potential to reach in the top Node War kill feeds chart, but is not very common due to how much effort, skill, or gear you would need to pull it off confidently. They are also not exactly the best when it comes to taking down structures, although honorable mentions to Succession's Funnel Guard AoE damage potential to put some damage on structures in a unique and plausible way. And lastly, in the Siege setting, Sorc's performance in Siege is arguably passable as not nearly as impactful as other casters in certain classes that are more suited for super large-scale PvP. Both Sorcs would find themselves doing the same thing as they normally would, except would only contribute heavily for the guild when pushing in on a castle to siege, allowing them to reach the backlane, picking off as many kills as possible before dying. More so suicide playstyle than before. Most assassins overall may not be that impactful in this case, but for Sorcs, they do still have the ability to cause distractions and possibly sneak into territories and forts to cause internal mayhem for as long as they could. In fact, it's quite common for Sorcs to go rogue and try to kill any stragglers they see isolated from big groups. Overall, Siege is not Sorc's strongest environment, but is still manageable due to skill and enough gear. With everything being said and mentioned, I will briefly discuss my summary thoughts on Sorcs overall after reworks and what could be improved on, as well as some issues that concerned many Sorc players as well. Plasma, a well-known Sorc main of both Awakening and Succession in the EU region, had this to say about the reworks. Overall, I'd say Awakening Sorc adapted in the meta and it didn't drown. However, she isn't crazy, or at least not crazier than some other contenders. She holds her spot as pretty solid all-rounder class. Her playstyle made her a really protected and bursty class, and a lot of people are not liking this playstyle as it derives a lot from what Sorc used to be. But in truth, old Sorc wouldn't have been able to survive in this meta. Succession Sorc got a lot better for PvE, but slightly worse for everything else. This is not the reason people quit the spec, however. The rework just pushed her in a direction I and a lot of other Succession Sorcs are not enjoying. Rather than addressing the movement and burst issues, they addressed the protection, which wasn't an issue in the first place, and thus to compensate for the lack of movement and try to survive in this meta, you just spent more time standing there and rotating frontals. Now, my personal and honest thoughts on both Awakening and Succession are this. With Awakening, I hardly touch or play the spec, to be quite frank, so I'll keep it short and simple. When it comes to Awakening, they overall at the very least kept Sorc eligible to keep up with the reworks in newer classes for the most part due to the changes in abilities they implemented, but they did so at a high cost that lots of Awakening Sorc players are not happy with. Not only did the class become much easier, but also forced into a direction of easier gameplay and with easier protected damage. They lost key mechanics and CCs in the process, which was the last few things keeping the soul of Awakening Sorc alive. The ability to craft skilled-based combos and using skill to outplay and execute your targets. Now with enough gear, less mechanics, and utility, Awakening Sorc mostly centers around using the same 3 to 4 protected damage and rotation for kills in PvP. In other words, Awakening Sorc has become an almost full-fledged super armor trading class, disregarding its prior playstyle. Awakening Sorc after reworks has been summarized as strong and effective, but watered down and inevitably boring. It's still overall in all aspects of the game a very strong class regardless. If you do not mind the things I've mentioned, this Awakening Sorc will still be a very solid pick in the game no matter what. When it comes to Succession Sorc, I've actually already summarized my issues with it in my Succession Sorc video, where I more or less rant about the issues and go into detail about them. I even made another video also suggesting and coming up with ideas, concepts, and fixes to Succession Sorc that could overall save the class. Succession Sorc, as much as we are grateful for the PvE buffs and finally have one identity, we still are, sadly, one of the bottom 5 1v1ers in the game. It sadly got way too many issues that need work and fix for it to be competent class design for 1v1s. And and its 1vx group fight is not that much spicier either. The frontals we acquired are a bit strange but workable for damage trade in neutral game. Although standing still in frontals shouldn't be the playstyle strategy of Succession Sorc, it's all we have and are forced to work with it. Sadly, Succession Sorc only became a competent PvE bot with the same lingering PvP issues it's had for well over a year and a half now. Succession Sorc is a class I still main, thankfully for its PvE aspect now, but also the concept and theme playstyle of Succession Sorc. Many players find it fun and interesting to play this assassin mage, and it could be the same for you. If you find this playstyle spec enjoyable, it could be a cool option to tag for PvE. Succession Sorc after reworks would be summarized as the competent grinder with a challenging PvP aspect. Its PvP may be fun for some, but definitely far from competitive. You can never go wrong picking this class for PvE though. And before I end this video, I want to give a special thanks and shout out to the man himself, Plasma. He's not only helped out with some of the general consensus on some of these topics, but also a big help in providing the necessary footage for me to use. He's very comfortable with switching between Awakening and Succession and has made this whole project easier to create. This video already took me countless hours and weeks to complete, so thanks to him I was able to cut off lots of time gathering footage and focusing on the editing portion. He's got a YouTube channel you can check out where he posts montages of Sorc and has plans to make some Sorc guides in the future. So once again, much appreciated for your help. And finally, with that being said, hopefully this video gave you guys a proper and clear introduction to Sorceress in 2022 after the reboot. You can come check out my other Sorc guides all over my channel if you guys are interested. If you guys are more than welcome to catch me live on Twitch on Friday and Sunday afternoon and midnight times. All the important links and information will be in the description. I appreciate you guys so much for watching this video, and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Are you guys sticking with Sorc, or is it time to move on? And which intro segment was your favorite out of them all in this video? And that's going to be it for this video. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.